Can I go ahead and give you the title to today's message? Are you ready? I already gave it to you. You didn't realize it. It's the power of getting ready in the pause. Some of y'all right now are confused because you got a text yesterday from the church that said we were starting a brand new series. Ha ha. We ain't. Somebody say the pause. Somebody say the power of getting ready in the pause. I'm going to be the first one to tell you, I thought we were done with the pause several weeks ago. If you'll remember last week, I told you that God said, I'm not done with the pause. I need you to stay in the pause. I want to pause in the pause. And so last week I preached a message because God placed in my spirit this thought. He said, my people have to understand the power of perseverance and the power of patience. And many times the reason why my people don't understand perseverance or are not able to persevere through the trial is because there's a disconnect between me and them. And so if you were here, we talked about James chapter 1, where James talked about the power of perseverance, but basically he said that perseverance is the product of our faith. That perseverance is the result of our faith. So if there's a problem with you being able to persevere, it has a lot to do with your faith. We have to look at our faith to make sure that our faith is what it's supposed to be. So I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know if today's the last message in the pause or not. I'm going to just go ahead and throw that out there. But what I do know is I'm just going to follow where God is leading. And so what I want to do today is I want to take you back to a message that we preached last week, because today is really a continuation of that message, because I believe God spoke in my spirit this week that I didn't finish with last week. And because he's not done with last week, we're going to revisit something this week that's going to be totally fresh and new. So here's what I want you to do. I've already given you the title. Somebody look at your neighbor and say, I'm getting ready. Look at somebody else and say, are you getting ready? It's the power of getting ready. Some of us haven't been getting ready, and we wonder why when we get there, we're not ready. Some of us are ignoring the journey, and we wonder why when we get to the destination doesn't mean as much to us as we thought it would. It's because we ignored the process that God was taking us through on the journey. Y'all don't want to hear this today, but I'm telling you, God's got something for some of you. And so I want to take you back to James, just a couple of verses in James, and then I'm going to take you to our text today. Let me go ahead and give you the text. 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 1 through 50. Yeah. But let me read something to you before we ever get to the text. I'll tell you what, you've been standing up a long time, so I want you just to go ahead and look at your neighbor and say, get ready. And then you can be seated. And you know, it's always funny, the ones who go, woo, are the ones that are already sitting down. So I'm going to take you to this place. Put it up on the screen for me. It's James chapter 1, a few verses that really will establish the context of conversation today. He says, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds. That in and of itself is a stumbling verse for many of us, because how in the world is a trial a joy? But he's telling us to make sure that our mind is a reflection of who God is, no matter what we're going through. And that we can still be in a place of joy even though we don't feel happy, but we feel heavy. It's a pretty heavy verse. Somebody say it's heavy. And then he says this in verse 4. He says, let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. Verse 5, if any of you lacks wisdom, then you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given unto you. Ooh, somebody say, I'm ready. And go back to verse 3, because I had this thought. Because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Now, before I move on, the word perseverance in the Greek, if you were here last week, is the word hupomone. Somebody say hupomone. Hupomone is a word, obviously, that means perseverance, but it's also a word in the English language that we can translate into the word patience. but it's kind of a different word. It paints a picture. It's a word illustration, if you will, because the word hupomone means to wait, but it's not a passive waiting. It's an active waiting. It means stand to do what you can while you're waiting. So it doesn't paint the picture of hanging out in the doctor's office, Kenny, while you're waiting on the doctor to call your name and you're in the waiting room. That would be considered a passive waiting. That is not an active waiting. So that is not hupomone. Hupomone paints the image of a person who's running a marathon, and he started the marathon, and he's about halfway through the marathon, and he's halfway to the finish line. He's halfway, if you will, away from the starting line. He can't see the starting line. He can't see the finish line, but he knows that the finish line is coming if he keeps doing what he's doing. And if he keeps doing what he's doing, he knows that he'll be holding on to God. He'll be hupomone-ing in our language. And he's holding on to God because he knows that the finish line is on the way. And so he's going to do what he can until he gets there, which is run the race. So I had another thought last week that I didn't get to that made me think about the trial. Go to verse 4. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. Go to verse 5. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God. Circle wisdom, circle ask God, circle something. So if any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God. There is this directive from James for us to be in communication with God, that our heart should connect with the heart of God. That there is this improving of our faith when we're in the trial, because we have a deep spiritual connection with God while we're in the trial. And basically what James is saying, if you'll remember, is that we've got to draw from the strength of God rather than dwell on our problem. It's draw, not dwell. Say it, draw, not dwell. It's drawing from the strength of God rather than dwelling on our issues. So I had this thought, if that is the case, and we're in the pause of life, but yet we're connecting with God because we realize that we've got to draw from Him rather than dwell on our issue, that means that the pause can't be all bad. Why? Because that means if you're using the pause to connect with God, then God is preparing your spirit for what He's about to connect you to. Did you grab that? If we're using the pause to connect to God, then God is He's building your spirit for what He's about to connect you to. And all of that takes place while we're in the pause. Oh, somebody say getting ready. In other words, God does not waste your wait. Some of you don't understand the wait. You can't figure out why it's taking so long. You don't understand why the pause in your life, and maybe the pause in your life is only in one area and everything else is good. But that one area is driving you crazy. That one area is overwhelming you. That one area seems to be too great. And now because of that one area, all of these other areas are full of tension. And some of you are thinking that God is not doing anything. But just because you don't feel like God is not doing anything, I need you to understand God is up to something. Just because you think nothing is happening does not mean that God is not doing something. God is getting you ready. Somebody say, I'm getting ready. So I'm going to take you to this passage of scripture today. In 1 Samuel chapter 17, it's a story about David and Goliath. It's a familiar story, but it's also something that God showed me in this story that I've never seen before. It's a fresh perspective. I've preached this story many times. You've heard this story many times, but I promise you I'm going to give you a different perspective today because God showed me something in this narrative. So I want to read some of these verses. Are you ready? There's 50 verses. Are you ready for me to read all 50? Some of y'all are laughing like, oh, please no, please no. Please tell him Jesus. Move him on over there, Jesus. I'm not going to read all 50. I am going to read some to give you some context. So can I start to read? Yes. Here's what it says in 1 Samuel chapter 17. Now the Philistines gathered their forces. Now listen to this intently. Don't just let me read and you think this is a time for your mind to wander, because you'll miss the context. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Soka in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes Dammim. You got to say that very carefully. Between Soka and Ezekah, Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites occupied the other, with the valley between them. Somebody say, the valley's in the middle. And there was a champion named Goliath who was from Gath, who came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale, armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. Needless to say, he was big. Somebody say, he's huge. Verse 8, Goliath stood and he shouted at the ranks of Israel, why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? So choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, then we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, then you will become our subjects and you will serve us. Then the Philistines said, this day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other. On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all of the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Now David, and that went on, by the way, for 40 days. Now David was the son of that dude named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time, he was very old. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to war. The firstborn was Eliab, the second Abinadab, the third Shammah. David, he was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days the Philistine came forward every morning and evening, 2 times a day, and he took his stand. Now Jesse said to his son David, take this ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers and hurry to their camp. Take along with you these 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit and see how your brothers are doing. So now Jesse said, I need you to DoorDash this food. Take the cheese, get it all there. Take this turkey club sandwich to your brothers who are on the front line and bring back the news that everything is good. And they are with Saul, and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah are fighting against the Philistines. So early in the morning, David left the flock in the care of a shepherd, loaded up and set out as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle position, shouting the war cry. They're ready to go out for battle. They've been doing this for 40 days. But it's verse 15. It's verse 15 that awakens something in my spirit. It's verse 15 that says this, but David went back and forth. Circle that, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep at Bethlehem. I need you to see this. I need you to live inside of this narrative and forget that you know this story from front to back and that you've heard it. But I want you to try to live inside of it real time with me today. David is going back and forth. David is going back and forth, but not only is David going back and forth, the nation of Israel is going back and forth because they've been in this place for 40 days. Every day they line up like they're going into battle, but nothing happens. So they go to the front of the line, if you will, and then that night they go back. It's back and forth. It's David back and forth. So the nation of Israel is on pause corporately, and the individual David is on pause. Back and forth. Some days he's in the palace and he's playing the harp. If you read the whole story about David, he's already been in the palace with Saul playing the harp and writing these songs that bring God glory and that lift up Saul. And days he's in there playing the harp, and then there are other days he's back in the field and tending sheep. There are days that he feels worthy of the palace because remember, he's already been anointed to be the future king at this point. He's heard he's going to be the king. And there's some days that he feels like he's living where he's supposed to live. He's in the palace. And then there's other days he's going back to the field. There's some days that he feels like he's got all of the authority that God had spoken over his life. But there's other days that he backs up and he feels like he's in the field of obscurity. There's some days that he feels like he's going to win and things are going the way they're supposed to go. And then there's other days that he feels like he's backing up and he's going to lose. And knowing what's been proclaimed over his life, but yet what's been proclaimed over his life hasn't come to fruition yet. And so he's going back and forth. Can you imagine the identity crisis in this moment? He feels like, I've been anointed to be king, but my dad's telling me I'm only worthy to deliver some sandwiches. He doesn't even believe in me. And sometimes I'm over here tending some sheep, and other times I feel like I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. Sometimes I feel like I'm going to get past this problem, but other times I feel like I'm not. Sometimes I feel like I'm taking 100 steps forward, but other times I feel like I'm taking 200 steps back. Sometimes I feel like this relationship is getting better. Sometimes I think this relationship is getting worse. Sometimes I think I'm walking the journey that God wants me to walk, and other times I wonder if even God is here with me. Sometimes I feel like I'm on this spiritual high, and sometimes I wonder if God even knows I exist. Sometimes I feel like I'm more than a conqueror, but sometimes I feel like the weight of the world is on top of me. Sometimes I feel like the job that God has for me is not really the job that I want. And sometimes I feel like God is with me on the job and everybody else is ignoring the fact that I'm anointed. Sometimes I feel unworthy. Sometimes I feel worthy. Sometimes I feel happy. Sometimes I feel heavy. Sometimes I feel faith, but sometimes I feel fear. Sometimes I feel insecurity, and sometimes I feel victory. It's back and forth. It's back and forth. Sometimes I feel like I'm a future king in waiting, and sometimes I'm shoveling sheep dung in the field. Can you imagine? Sometimes I'm holding on to my future, but sometimes the past is holding on to me. Ooh. And so while you're going back and forth, though, God is not wasting David's wait. Chris, God's not wasting David's wait. You see, just because you're not there yet doesn't mean God's not taking you there. I need somebody to hear this. Just because you haven't made it there doesn't mean you're not going there. And so David, kind of in all of this stuff happening. But I need you to notice something about David. Thanks, Chris. I need you to notice something about David in this story before we go anywhere else, is that David is a little different than us. David is not destination minded. In our culture today, we've become destination minded. We're thinking about getting there. And getting there, we ignore the journey to get there because the destination is what seems to be most important to us. We want to get there as fast as we can. We want to get there on a trip, on a vacation. You despise the journey because you're ready to get there. And in life, it's the same way. We just want to get there. But the problem is if we ignore the beauty of the journey and the preparation that God is doing in our lives on the journey, when we get there, we won't be ready for the destination, nor will the destination be ready for us. And so the destination won't meet our expectation because it's not what we thought it was going to be. And because it's not what we thought it was going to be, that destination isn't good enough. So now we begin to look for the next destination. The next thing, the next. And just because what you're doing in the moment seems meaningless and unfruitful, it doesn't mean that it is meaningless and unfruitful. Just because in the moment things aren't quite going the way you expected doesn't mean that God is still not preparing you for the thing that's ahead of you. Just because right now you're in the field doesn't mean you haven't been called to be in the palace. And just because right now you're not living in the promise doesn't mean you're not in preparation. And right now, just because you haven't arrived there doesn't mean that I'm not taking you there. I need somebody to get this. You see, the distance between back and forth is the space called preparation. I want you to look at it like that. The distance between back and forth is the space called preparation. What are you doing in the space called preparation? Because if you're not allowing God to prepare you, and if you're not getting prepared, then you'll always hang out in the back and forth, because the destination you will not arrive there. I'm going to show that to you in this text. So, what are you doing in the space called preparation? Because there was a great conflict for David. There was a conflict because he'd been anointed king. It had been spoken over his life, but it hasn't come to fruition. There's a conflict because part of the time he's hanging out with Saul, who is the king, and he's playing the harp for him, and he's playing worship music, and he's writing worship music. But then other times he's hanging out in the field and he's dealing with some sheep. And then other times his brothers are rejecting him. And then other times his father doesn't believe in him. And then other times there's all of this other turmoil that's happening in his life. And it's all in the back and forth moments. And then I want to show you something in verse 28 and 29. Let me read this. It says, when Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men. So, in other words, David has arrived at the front line. David has gotten there, and David's kind of talking to everybody. You remember Jesse said, I need you to find out what's going on and bring me back the news. And so he's at the front line and he's talking. So Eliab hears him, David's oldest brother. He heard him speaking with the men. And so Eliab, he burned with anger at him, and he asked, why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? And I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down here only to watch the battle. Now, what does David say to him in verse 29? David says this. He says, well, what have I done? Can I not even say a word? Can I not get a word in edgewise? What have I done to you? I need you to understand the history here. The history is when David was anointed to be king, there was a king choosing party at David's dad's house. Jesse had brought in all of his sons. All of those sons paraded by Samuel. And they all looked good. They all looked kingly. But yet God didn't choose any of those people. And so Samuel's scratching his head, and he looks at Jesse, and he said, you got any more boys? Jesse said, yeah, I got one. He's just a little old kid. He's just an old Rudy fella. He's out in the field tending some sheep. He didn't even get invited to the king choosing party. He was left out in the field. His own daddy didn't believe in him enough to even invite him. And Samuel says, you need to send for him. And when he gets there, he gets anointed to be the future king. So now you got this brotherly resentment, if you will. And so David goes to the front line just to deliver the DoorDash that his dad asked him to deliver. He said, Eliab, you need to eat your turkey sandwich. He says, can I even speak? Again, it's like back and forth, back and forth. All I did was what my dad told me to do. And I mean, 4 days ago, I was playing the harp for Saul. And then last night, I had to go over there and I had to shovel all the stuff up that the sheep had done. And then now today, I'm coming over here and my own brothers don't even like me. Can you imagine this? Back and forth, back and forth. And I thought, how can I illustrate this? Doug, I thought, how can I illustrate this? What's a way that I can better understand this back and forth? And then I had this thought. On Sundays, generally speaking, I make about 13,000 steps according to the app on my iPhone. 13,000 steps. That's a lot of steps. Somebody said, that's a lot. Now, all of my steps are in between my office and the stage, and my office in the green room, and down the hallways, and back on the stage. It's the back and forth. It's the back and forth. It's the back and forth. Some of y'all say, yeah, he goes back and forth a lot. But I thought about that. It's 13,000 steps, but I'm really not going anywhere. It's back and forth. And then God quickened my spirit. It's 13,000 steps. You're not really going anywhere, but my word's going forth. Ooh. And so I have to wonder if David in the back and forth doesn't realize it, but God's word is still going forth. God's word is still being spoken. God's word is still coming to fruition. It's just David is in the back and forth preparation season, that space called preparation. So think about this. Somebody say, get ready. So here you've got David. David has been anointed to be the king. David has been the harpist. David has been the shepherd. David has been the sandwich delivery boy. But now you got Goliath. And Goliath is hanging out every day. He comes out for 40 days, 2 times a day. And Goliath is like, send me a man who can fight me. Don't send me any more wimps. I need a man who can come out here and take me on. I heard that Optimus Prime is retiring and they need a new voice. I've been working on it. I'm just telling you, I'm working on it. Trying to bring some money to the church. That's all I'm trying to say. But here's Goliath. He's out there every day. It's this antagonistic, like, who do y'all think you are? You need to send somebody out here. I'm tired of coming out here and nobody wanting to fight me. And there's Goliath, just this antagonistic giant that's has all of Israel terrified. And I wonder if sometimes if we don't have a giant that has us stuck on pause. And sometimes that giant is a person. Sometimes it's not a person. Sometimes that giant is a place. It's a place of brokenness. Sometimes that giant is a place that continues to tell you that you will never be. Sometimes that giant is a job. And you don't feel like that job is recognizing the talents that you have. Sometimes that giant is standing before you and antagonistically just absolutely beating you up every single day. But then you've got David over here, who his dad, Jesse, says, I want you to take these sandwiches to the front line. Now, I want you to think about that. His dad doesn't even believe in him. His dad doesn't even believe in him. And his dad says, you know what? I need you to take these sandwiches to the front line. His brothers don't believe in him. He said, you don't even have a big flock you're taking care of. It's just a little old small flock. Why don't you head back to them? This would have been the opportunity when Jesse said to David, knowing David in his mind is thinking, you know what, I'm a future king. And Jesse comes up to him and says, I need you to take this lunch to them and I need you to get it there quick. It would have been easy for David to say, nah, nope, ain't doing it. He's a teenager. So, not voice changing. I ain't doing that. I'm a card-carrying king here, so I ain't doing that. You can get somebody else. I ain't doing it. But no, David didn't say that. David did it. What did he do? He did it. Why? Because David had a servant's heart. I need you to grab this. He did it. He played the harp when he needed to play the harp. He hung out in the field tending the sheep when he needed to tend the sheep. He took the sandwiches to the front line when he needed to take the sandwiches to the front line. There was this servant's heart that you see inside of David. You see, many times the destination that you are going is connected to your willingness to serve before you get there. Did you hear that? Many times the destination that you are going to is connected to your willingness to serve before you ever even get there. And if you're not willing to serve along the journey, do you really think that the destination is where you need to be? Because God is going to use you in the ways that he prepared you when you get to that destination. And if you're not willing to serve along the journey, you won't be willing to serve in the destination. So Saul was like, I know I'm crazy. I'll be here all week though. So Saul, where's the verse I'm at? Just take me to where I'm going. I don't remember. 31 or something like, okay, 31. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul. So Saul sent for him. Verse 32, David said to Saul, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go out and fight him. Your servant will go out and fight him. And so verse 34, or verse 33, Saul replied, you're not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth. Now Saul doesn't even believe in him. Back and forth. Somebody say back and forth. Somebody say, I'm getting ready. So grab this. But David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. Hold on a second before I finish reading this. So Saul doesn't believe in him. Saul said, you're just a young guy, and he's been fighting since longer than you've been born. And he's a mighty warrior, and you're nothing but a harpist and a shepherd. Oh yeah, and a delivery boy. You can't take him on. But look at what David says. David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it. I struck it, and I rescued the sheep from its mouth. And when it turned on me, I seized it by its hair. I struck it and killed it. What? Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them because he has defied the armies of the living God. So Saul doesn't believe in him, but David's saying, guess what? I've been in preparation. I've been out in the field, that lonely field at night when I wasn't playing the harp for you. In the lonely field, I've been out there. I've been getting ready. I've been finding stones, and I've been putting them in my pouch, and I've been taking out of my pouch at night, and I've been trying to see how close I can get to something, and I've been just seeing how fast I can get that sling up to, and I've been preparing. I've been lonely, and while I wasn't doing that, I was just praising God, and while I wasn't doing that, I was writing some songs, but I've been getting ready. You might not have realized I've been getting ready, but I've been getting ready. God's been preparing me for this moment. Somebody say, I'm getting ready. So in the back and forth, he's being prepared. And so Saul does something. He says this, he says, the Lord has rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, and he will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. Saul said to David, go, and the Lord will be with you. Oh, verse 38, watch this. Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. Now, hold on a second. God had been preparing David in the field. But in the field, he didn't prepare him with a sword or a shield. He prepared him with something that didn't make any sense. Goliath had been prepared his entire life for this moment with the sword, the shield, and the javelin. Goliath was a mighty warrior who killed many. Goliath was willing to fight tens of men. Here's David, who's never fought a man as far as Saul's concerned, and he's been out in the field just practicing, and Saul has seen him only play in the harp. He hadn't seen him throw the sling yet. He didn't know anything about that. But David's like, I'm ready. And so Saul says, then let me put my armor on you. And so David fastened on his sword and over the tunic, and he tried to walk around in it because he was not used to them. He said, I can't go in these, he said. He said, because I'm not used to them. Hold on, you're going a little too fast for me. Go back. He said, because I'm not used to them. So he took them off. Just pause right there. So he took them off. I want you to visualize this because everybody's watching Saul because Saul is the king. And remember, over here in the valley, you've got Goliath. Send me a man. So everybody's like, what's Saul going to do? What's he going to do? And then over here, they see Saul putting his armor on this little boy. And he's somewhere between the ages of 13 and 20. So he's still got teen behind his number. Whether he's 14, 15, 19, he's in that range. And so everybody's like, what in the world is going on? And Saul is putting on his armor on David. And David is trying to walk around in it, but he can't walk around in it because David is short and Saul is tall and it's way too big for him. He's clumsy. And everybody's like, oh, what in the world's going to happen to us? Because if this boy goes out there, I want you to think about this because the bet, if you will, is send somebody out to fight me. And if I kill them, then y'all are ours. And he's about to go out and Saul's going to let him go out. Does that not tell you how desperate Saul was? Think about the fear that Saul must have had to say, okay, I'm going to let this teenage boy go out because all I know him as is a harpist, but he says he can do this. But he said, I can't do it. He said, I got to take all of this off because I can't use it. You see, because God didn't prepare David with the sword. God prepared David with a sling. Think about this. God was trying to do a greater miracle than Saul was even aware of. Because had David used Saul's armor, guess what would have happened? Saul would have gotten credit for the battle. God didn't want Saul to get credit. That's why he used David the way he used him, and he was preparing him in the field when David was going back and forth and was kind of getting sick of the back and forth. God was preparing him. He was preparing him for something better. You see, so David wasn't flattered by Saul's endorsement. David wasn't flattered by the endorsement, you can use all of my stuff. David wasn't flattered by that because David wouldn't lose sight of the purpose that God had for him, the preparation that God had brought him through, the practice with the sword. Because on the journey of back and forth in the space called preparation, David was getting ready in his spirit. So he said, I'm not used to them. And you can imagine if the people were watching this thing unfold that they had to sense a little bit of frustration in David's part. Because, Richie, David was putting on somebody else's armor that was a lot taller than him, trying to fight a battle in armor he had never worn before, using a sword and a shield in a way that he had never done before. And it looks frustrating for him to watch, and for people to watch this, and it's frustrating for David to live through this. And so I had this thought. I wonder if sometimes our frustration in life comes from the fact that we're trying to use something for a purpose that it was not created for. I wonder if our frustration in life is because we're trying to put on somebody else's stuff when God didn't prepare us for that stuff. I wonder if in life we get frustrated because we're trying to wear somebody else's blessings rather than walk in the blessings that God has for us. Good Lord, have mercy. You see, I wonder if David was losing confidence in the armor when he had it on because God didn't prepare him for the armor. You see, it wasn't Saul's armor that brought David confidence. It was God who brought David confidence. I need somebody to hear this. It is not your job that brings you confidence. It's the God who gave you that job that brings you confidence. But I wonder if sometimes we're so frustrated because we're trying to put on the stuff of others, the blessings of others, the abilities of others, the talents of others, and we're trying to walk in something that God didn't create us to walk in, and we wonder why we can't get to the destination because you're trying to live somebody else's destination. Woo. So, in a spiritual sense, Saul's armor didn't fit David spiritually either. Because Saul had been sitting there watching this thing play out and seeing Goliath come out for 40 days. Send me a man. For 40 days he'd been watching that. For 40 days he was terrified. For 40 days he was fearful. But you got to keep in mind, where had David been for the last 40 days? He'd been out hanging out with the sheep. While he was hanging out with the sheep, he was writing some songs, and he was growing more dependent upon God. For the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside of quiet waters. He restoreth my soul. Saul was thinking, if you take my armor out, maybe you'll have a better chance. But Saul's armor was not how God had prepared David. God had prepared David in the darkness, in the loneliness of the field while he was practicing his slingshot. That's when God was preparing David for the fight against Goliath. But guess what? Where was Goliath at? Goliath was standing in the valley. You see, God was preparing David for the battle in the valley. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will not fear, for his rod and his staff, they comfort me. Are you grabbing this? In the back and forth, God was preparing David. In the back and forth, had God not prepared David with the sling, David would have never become the king. Had God not prepared David with the sling, he would have never occupied the palace. Had God not prepared David with the sling, David would have walked right past the purpose that God had for him because he would have settled for the armor that he did not prepare with. And I don't know who needs to hear this, but I think sometimes in your back and forth season, you think God has forgotten you, but I need you to hear this. This is prophecy for somebody. God is baking something in the oven for you. God has something in the oven that is baking for you. He's just preparing you. But I also need somebody to hear this. Just because it doesn't make sense, it didn't make sense to send this teenage boy out with a slingshot against this giant. But can I tell you something? God is going to do things in your life that do not make sense. But you need to realize this and understand this. God is going to do things that do not make sense. But you cannot call Jesus Lord and still try to make your decisions through logic. Did you hear me? You cannot call Jesus Lord but still allow logic to be your decision maker. You're going to have to walk in faith, and there are going to be times it doesn't make sense. There's going to be times that you're going to be standing in front of a giant. It may not be a person. It may be a problem. It may be an emotional difficulty. It may be your finances. It may be something else. But are you going to be walking in the preparation that God has for you? Or are you going to just try to say, you know what? I'm going to be looking for another destination. I don't want this preparation. I don't want this journey. I got to show you something else. Let me read a few verses. Verse 41, I think is where we're at. Verse 41. Meanwhile, the Philistine with his shield bearer in front of him, he kept coming closer to David. Watch this. He looked David over as he got close enough to where he could actually see him. You know how when you're a long distance from somebody, you think they're real tall, and you get up on them and they're real short. Or vice versa. They look really short and you get up on them, they're really tall. But he looked at David over and over and he said, man, you ain't nothing but a boy. He's glowing with health and he's handsome. And he despised him. That just tells us that Goliath was ugly. He despised him. He said, David, am I a dog? Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Verse 44, come here, he said, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals. So even Goliath didn't believe in him. Of all the people in this story, it makes sense for Goliath not to believe in him because Goliath's 9 foot tall and this dude, he's 5'1". So here is Goliath, or David, standing on the battlefield. What's David's response going to be? David said to the Philistine, you come against me with the sword and the spear and even the javelin. But I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Do you see the confidence? Verse 46, this day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and I'll cut off your head. This very day I'll give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. Oh boy, Lord have mercy. All those who gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves. I didn't have to use all that stuff over there that Saul tried to give me. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. Verse 48, as the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Hold on a second. So here they're coming towards one another. They're converging on one another. But Goliath is kind of walking like, I got this. But David is running towards the battle. There was a back and forth season in David's life. But right now, all he's doing is heading forward. And he's running. And as he's running, he's reaching in his bag and taking out a stone. He slung it. And he struck the Philistine in the forehead, and the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. Verse 50, so David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine, and he killed him. David's like, I don't need the armor or sword. God's been preparing me. God didn't send me down here with some armor and a sword. God sent me down here with a slingshot. God has been preparing me for this moment. And then it hit me. God didn't send David to slay Goliath. I need you to hear me on this. God did not send David to slay Goliath. God prepared David to slay Goliath. But God didn't send David to slay Goliath. I need you to look at it this way. God didn't send David to slay Goliath. God sent Goliath to prove to David that there was a giant slayer in his spirit. Because he had been preparing him for this moment, he sent Goliath there so that David would realize there's a giant slayer in his spirit. You see, had David not been practicing and praying over here in the darkness and the loneliness of the field, he wouldn't have been ready when Goliath was standing in front of him. But God knew that he was sending Goliath. He was just trying to prepare David to be a giant slayer. Are you a giant slayer? I need somebody to get up on your feet in this place. Because if you'll get ready, if you'll allow God to get you ready, God will get you to that destination. And when you get to that destination, God will do a finishing work. I got to show you one more thing and I'm going to close with this, I promise. Somebody say, I'm getting ready. Look at your neighbor and say, I'm getting ready. How did this thing start out? It started out last week in the book of James. It started out today in the book of James. But it's verse 4 that says, let perseverance finish its work. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. It's the preparation. It's you being able to persevere through the preparation. The space called preparation in the back and forth, that God wants to do a finishing work in your life. Some of you have given up on God doing a finishing work, and God today is wanting you to hear, he who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it, because God is getting you ready. God's about to do a finishing work. I'm getting ready. Somebody say, I'm getting ready. Somebody needs to know he's getting you ready. He's getting you ready for a victory. He's getting you ready to be broken out of that brokenness. He's getting ready to take you somewhere. He's getting ready to prove to you that you're more than a conqueror. He's getting ready to bring glory into your life, because the glory of God will begin to open up doors in your life. He's getting you ready. He's getting you ready for what he's proclaimed over your life. He's getting you ready because he's taking things off of your life that others have proclaimed over you. But I'm getting ready. I'm getting ready to run into victory. I'm getting ready to run into what God has for me. I'm getting ready. Somebody say, I'm getting ready. I just sense in my spirit today that God is absolutely about to walk some of you into something he's been preparing you for a long time. Some of you have given up on it. Get ready. 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 Get ready, get ready, get ready, get ready, get ready, get ready, get ready.